Good evening, dear church. Tonight I'm going to talk about the 3 signs of pure devotion to God, or let me say, I'd like us to remember 3 signs of pure devotion to God, with which I will conclude this lesson for tonight. If you've got your Bible with you, please open it in the book of Ezra, chapter 3, verse 7 to 13. That's the text that we're going to look at tonight. But before we get there, let me just give us a quick recap and remind you of where we are in the story of God. God made a promise to the Israelites already before they entered the promised land, that if they sin against Him, He will banish them from the land. And wherever they are taken captive and wherever they find themselves in the world, if from there they seek God with all of their hearts, He would hear them, reach out for them, and bring them back to their land. And God promised that also during or even before the exile, that they would come back to Jerusalem after they've been taken captive by the Babylonians. And He said that if they do get dispersed like that and taken captive by foreign nations, God will bring them back and they will inhabit the lands that God gave their forefathers, that the temple would be rebuilt. This is what God said, okay? The articles of the temple would be restored, and worship and life, as the Israelites experienced it in Jerusalem, would be restored to normality. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah records this. Ezra and Nehemiah records this return from Babylon. And that's what we're dealing with at this moment in time. In the first chapter, we saw God move Cyrus's heart to send a proclamation throughout his kingdom to inform the Jews that they could go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And then God moved, in the same chapter, the people's hearts, the Jews, moved their hearts to pack up and to do this and to go back to Jerusalem. The temple articles were given back by Cyrus in fulfillment of the prophecy that God gave, and those articles were counted. In chapter 2, we see the names of the families and the number of people returned from captivity. We call them the remnant. Their names and the amount of people has been recorded. And it seems like they just quickly, sort of when they arrived in Judea, it seems like they just put down their bags quickly at their houses, and then they got their homes quickly ready, and then they gathered in Jerusalem at the site of the temple. Although the book of Haggai tells us a little bit of a different story. Haggai tells us that the Jews, when they came back, they first fixed their own homes properly before they went to go build the temple. In any case, the people, regardless of what Haggai says, let's follow just Ezra here. Ezra says they sort of quickly sorted out their homes, and then they came into Jerusalem, all of them as one man, and they began to build the altar, because the first thing that they wanted to do is to make sacrifices to God like Noah did after the flood. And these sacrifices had a double meaning. First of all, it showed that they were totally devoted to God, because it was burnt offerings. That's what we spoke about last week. And secondly, it showed that they really wanted to please God, because we saw with the flood that when Noah made a sacrifice, it really pleased God, and it inspired God to make promises to the human race. And so I'm sure these Israelites wanted the blessing of God, and that's why they made these sacrifices. And that sort of brings us up to the point where we are today. And this is what the text says further then for today. What did they do next? What did they do next? Verse 7 says, this is chapter 3 of Ezra, verse 7. Then they gave money to the masons and carpenters, and gave food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus, the king of Persia. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of the brothers, the priests and the Levites, and all who had returned from the captivity to Jerusalem, began the work, appointing Levites 20 years of age and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. Jeshua and his sons and brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, descendants of Hodaviah, and the sons of Henadad and their sons and brothers, all Levites, joined together in supervising those working on the house of God. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love to Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. Now, I hope you read that with me, or at least you gathered with me what is going on in this text. Nothing complicated, but I think there's at least 4 important things that I picked up in this text that I just want to share with you and make an application for. The first thing that is interesting for me is how they are repeating their parents' ways, their forefathers. A key theme that we have seen so far in the first 3 chapters is how everything that they now are experiencing and doing has in a way been done before by their forefathers. They are repeating what their forefathers did. For example, the Israelites were released from Egypt, and so these remnant Israelites were released from Persia. Supported by the people of Egypt, we see when they left Pharaoh's place. So we also see that the king of Persia tells all the people surrounding the Jews to support the Jews as they go back to build the temple. The people were counted before they entered the promised land of Canaan. And so also before they come and they settle again in Judea, the people are counted again. Okay, and now we see them copying the same actions as David and Solomon did in the preparation for the first temple that they built. For example, Solomon's temple also received cedar logs from Lebanon via Joppa. That is a key feature that we see in this text. And so they want the same cedar logs from the same place, and they have to come the same way via Joppa. And so what do we learn from this Jewish community, this remnant, is that they respected the ways and the actions of their forefathers. You see, because when they thought back to when the temple was built first, they knew God's blessing rested on it. And they wanted God's blessing now when they also started building this temple. You see, if they wanted the same blessings as their forefathers, they had to perform the same actions as their forefathers who walked in the faith. And so the lesson for me is this: fools ignore the blessed ways of their parents. We tend to easily think today that we know more and that we understand better than our parents. We understand life better. We can make better decisions than our forefathers. Ladies and gentlemen, no, we don't. We might know Google better. We might know iPads better. But when it comes to life and walking with God, we don't. I've got parents, forefathers who walked with God for 60 years. For 60 years, they walked in a prayerful relationship, listening to God and His Word. How can I possibly claim that my ways are definitely better than their ways? There's a Chinese proverb that says, to forget one's ancestors is to be a book without a source, a tree without roots. Now, we don't worship our forefathers. We don't worship our ancestors, although that's prominent in Africa. But we don't ignore, we should never ignore what they did right and learn from it. And we see these Jews do that in this text. There's a second interesting thing that stands out for me in this text, and that's that the Levites are overseeing the construction. It struck me that 20-year-old Levites had authority over, for example, 60-year-old carpenters and masons and builders. Experienced people were going to build the temple. Older people, qualified people, yet 20-year-old Levites would have authority over them. That's interesting for me. Levites didn't have skill in construction. They were either scribes, or they were secretaries, or they were doorkeepers. That was their jobs. Some of them were just musicians. The only thing that they could do is either sing or play an instrument. They were not skilled in construction. I mean, imagine a 20-year-old Levite saying, I can sing, but you need to throw the concrete correctly there. It's not going to work. Yet these guys, although they weren't skilled in construction, they were given authority over those who did the building. Why? Well, we see in Numbers chapter 1, verse 47 to 53, that it was the job of the Levites to protect and to take care of the sacredness when the tabernacle was built. They had the responsibility of caring for and overlooking the building so no one transgressed God's holy things. You see, the temple was a holy place, and God had rules about its construction. For example, they were not allowed to carve or chisel in stone any form of an image or a man or a beast in it or on it or around the sacred place. And so these Levites had to make sure that these carpenters and masons, that they didn't do any of that. There were engravings in some places of the temple, but it was flowers and fruits or plants, but never with a human face or that of an animal. Even the two cherubim, right, on top of the tabernacle, they were faceless. They didn't have faces. And this was done to ensure that no one ever gets tempted to worship the place or the cherubim. People weren't even allowed to come into the temple area with normal coins, because many of the coins had the faces of emperors and gods on them. And so the coins were exchanged for temple coins. And so you could exchange your coins at the gate so that you could go into the temple area with what we call temple coins. Now, who made sure that these rules were being kept? The Levites. And the Levites were a special breed. Leviticus 21:17 to 24 says none of them was allowed to have any physical defect or blemish on his body. Jewish tradition says there were at least 104 defects that could disqualify them, and about 22 others that could permanently disqualify them from service at the temple. Here's some examples. If you were blind, or you were lame, or you had a flat nose, I found that interesting, or you were hunchbacked or dwarfed, or you had scabs, or you were a eunuch, you were not allowed to be a Levite. You were not allowed to fulfill Levite duties at the temple. And so these Levites, when they did come to the temple when it was fully built, then they would be dipped in the mikveh before they could enter the temple. And so these were extremely holy people. And they were chosen to overlook the work, not because of the technical know-how related to temple construction, but because of the sanctity of the actual physical building. It had to be done in honor of God with no defects. And so here you have 20-year-olds telling 50-year-olds how to do their job, or overlooking their work. And what's the lesson here I'd like to pull out? Well, wisdom, or God's presence and God's Spirit, does not always come with age. Sometimes age comes alone. Some of them were only 20 years old, yet they had more spiritual authority than older construction workers. And we need to be reminded that wisdom comes from the Spirit of God. I'm reminded of Job 32, verse 6 to 9. Listen to this. A young man is talking for the first time between the friends of Job. And he says to them the following: I am young in years, and you are old. That is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. I thought age should speak, advanced years should teach wisdom. But it is the Spirit in a man, the breath of the Almighty, that gives him understanding. It is not only the old that are wise, not only the aged that understands what is right. It is not our technical skills in life that gives us authority in God's things, but it is our spirituality. And our spirituality is not necessarily dependent on age. There's a third thing that stands out for me in this text as well, is that these people were weeping and rejoicing at the same time. It is intriguing for me to see two groups of people responding totally in the opposite way than the other because of the same event. I want to zoom into quickly the people who wept while the foundation was being laid. The text doesn't tell us why they cried. All we know is that it was the older people who saw the temple that Solomon had built. It's those people that were crying. Haggai sort of gives us an indication as to what the problem is when he says in Haggai chapter 2 verse 3, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Doesn't it seem to you like nothing? They remembered. And so there was a group of people that remembered what the previous temple looked like, its size, its glory, and its beauty. And what they saw now was nothing in comparison. They had a physical picture in front of them of what their sins managed to cause, the destruction of God's house. And so I think this cry was a cry of disappointment in themselves. And so you had two groups, those who never saw a temple and those that did. One group saw the destruction caused by sin and the other didn't. And so they rejoiced. So it was an interesting experience, I think, for them. One group, I can imagine the older people thinking, you know what, this could have been avoided. You see, the rebuilding, we believe, started in 538 BC. It's 50 years since Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem and totally wiped out and tore down the temple. And you might be wondering, but God said that they will be in captivity for 70 years. Some scholars say, well, that 70 years refers to the 70 years for Babylon. And so some of these people that managed to return to Jerusalem were probably 70, 80 years old. They were in captivity for 50 years. Okay, and they remember vividly, they were 30 years old when they were taken into captivity. They remember vividly what the temple looked like, and now all they see is a barren piece of land and concrete being thrown for this temple. And they are emotional because they were part of the group of people who caused the destruction of this temple. Mossel Jacobs is an Olympic runner, and I read his story this week. Usain Bolt, okay, is the fastest man ever to live, people have said. And he won the 100 meters sprint in the 2016 Olympic Games. And everyone wondered who would become the next star, who would fill his shoes, who could ever run again as fast as he did. Well, a French man by the name of Mossel Jacobs this week took the gold medal in a faster time than Usain Bolt did, 9.80 seconds. The first time that he ever ran below 10 seconds was in May of this year, 10 weeks ago. He used to be a long jumper, so he's not even a professional sprinter. Anyways, it's an interesting story, but he went across the line when he won with a loud shout and scream. And then they interviewed him afterwards, and this is what he said. He said, "It's a dream. It's fantastic. It's a gold medal. It's forever. My scream expressed all the pain from the past. Now it is a scream of joy." And so he screamed once, but he said, in that scream is pain mixed with joy. And those words struck me, especially as I was studying, looking at this text here, because I think it neatly illustrates what the remnant was going through. There was joy mixed with pain when the foundation was being laid, because one group sees the pain, but there used to be a temple here. We destroyed it through our sin. And there's another group there thinking, wow, we've never had a temple. This is going to be amazing. We're actually going to participate in worshiping God, the God our forefathers told us about. And the temple that our forefathers told us about, we're going to make use of now. The point is this, the lesson I'd like us to take home on this is the following. Protect what you value now, or you will cry about it later. Protect what you value now, or you will cry about it later. Those weeping at the temple were part of the culprit generation, and they didn't protect the temple back then. They were part of it. They were sinners too. They turned their backs on God too. It's too late to appreciate the things you value when it has been taken from you. A quote I just find so interesting is this. Isn't it ironic? We ignore the ones who adore us. Adore the ones who ignore us. Love the ones who hurt us. And hurt the ones who love us. In a similar way, these Jews ignored the one who loved them most, God. And this weeping remnant now saw with their own eyes how a silly thing that was. There's a fourth thing that I pick up in this text, and it's that they were laying the foundation. They were laying the foundation. Without a solid foundation, you'll have trouble creating anything of value. You can't build a great building on a weak foundation. And so the laying of the foundation was huge. If the temple was to be built well, the foundation had to be strong, durable, exact, and solid. And there's just one lesson I'd like to take out of this. Since they had the singers ready with the laying of the foundation. This was a big thing to lay the foundation, because this was the foundation upon which their worship would be built, literally. And here's the lesson. A shaky foundation leads to a shaky life. In the New Testament, we see two temples. Okay, first of all, your body, 1 Corinthians 6 verse 19, and then the church, Ephesians 2 verse 21. I would like to stretch it to mean that your temple is not only your body, but it is your individual life. Jesus talks about the idea that you need to, the wise man builds his house upon the rock, right? Now, the rock is the foundation and the house is your life. And then I would like to say that the church is the Christian communal life. And that also needs to be built on a foundation. And so our lives and the church's life needs to be built upon the correct foundation. Now listen to what Paul says the foundation is. In Ephesians 2:19-20, you are no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household, built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Jesus Christ himself as the chief cornerstone. There is only one foundation to build your life on, to build the church on. The scripture says that the foundation is Jesus, the apostles, and the prophets. Nothing else. No, there's no other foundation. Okay? Not social media. I speak to flat earthers and I ask them, well, where do you find your source of truth? What's your foundation for making the claims that you're making? Well, let me show you this video. Whoa. So you go to YouTube to go find out what is true or not. You go to Facebook videos to find out what's true or not. It's a shaky foundation. Okay, so social media, not even science, because so much in science hasn't been even finalized yet. Okay, a lot of it is theories, not politics. Well, I believe what I believe because this is what the president says, not popular social opinions. I mean, I spoke to a 15-year-old the other day, and she's 15 years old, and she's fornicating all over the show. I said to her, why are you doing this? How do you know this is right or wrong? And she says, well, all my friends are doing it. The whole school thinks it's okay. So I'm like, okay, so you're basing your source of truth. Your foundation is popular social opinion. I mean, you can't even trust your inert rationality. Talk to people, I ask them, why do they have this view and that view? They say, well, it makes sense to me. My mind tells me this, and this what makes sense to me. I spoke to a guy on Sunday trying to teach them the gospel. I said, well, where do you get your source of truth from? What is your foundation? He says to me, no, you know what, when it feels right, feels good. So your feelings have now become a source of truth. This is no reason why the world is in a mess, ladies and gentlemen. If we follow popular opinion, we follow our own, 4-pound or 2-pound brain, to discover, to figure out what truth is. We can't even trust our own brains. Okay? If we use these, social media and all these shaky ways of coming to truth, no wonder our lives is a mess. And I see this too often. Ladies and gentlemen, the source of truth is God's word, the testimony of Jesus Christ, the testimony of the apostles. And if people disagree with what the apostles and the prophets and Jesus says, I'm very sorry, but that is just foolish. And we need to help people get back to what Scripture says. Because that's the reason why their lives are messed up. Now, it took me some time to get here, but I'm finally here. The main points of this lesson I will now give as a conclusion. As I read this text, I noticed the actions of the remnant as they came together to build this temple. They had a spectacular attitude. Their goal was to restore the presence of God among them. They wanted God to stay with them in Israel, live with them. And that is why they eagerly did all they could to lay the temple foundation and start the work. Now, we as a church community should have the same priority of wanting God to stay with us, be in our presence, Be present in Sweet Home. Work mighty deeds among us. Reach the lost. Be powerfully noticed. Or be powerful. Be a powerful testimony in the country of God's presence. In the county of God's presence as well. We need the same attitude. Now, in my short life, I have noticed how most Christians don't have the same attitude as these remnant Israelites. I hereby point out 3 areas in which they did for their temple, which most Christians do the opposite for their church. And I'd like to note that the 3 ways of the remnant indicates to us the supreme attitudes that pure and genuine Christians should be having. Number 1, they were giving, not taking. They were giving, not taking. The first verse of this section of text says, "Then they gave money to the masons and carpenters." They were not there to take. You might say, well, who takes money from the church? Well, you might be surprised some people do. But I'm talking more about that, about more than money. I'm talking about an attitude. Some people do church with the expectation of receiving word, receiving encouragement, receiving good worship experience, receiving food, receiving counseling, receiving care, receiving help. And that is fine, and that is good. The church exists to help others, to help one another. But you've got to upgrade at some point or another and move on from being a receiver in the church to become a giver in the church. And this is often what separates a mature Christian from an immature one. The mature one has moved beyond receiving and wants to just give. Point number 2, they were working, not sitting. Verse 8 says they all began the work. They had a passionate mission. They were sold on it. They desperately wanted God, and so they worked on it. I've been making disciples for a while, and I've seen churches grow, and I've helped churches grow. And one thing people don't realize is this. Churches grow because people are willing to work, period. Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 9, we worked night and day. The reason why Paul was so successful in his ministry is because he worked hard. If everybody just sits on Sundays and sits on Wednesdays in the building, the church won't grow. It won't. I'm being a prophet here. It won't. Do it and let's see what happens. That's how it works. Highway 20 will not become a vivid mark in Lynn County. It's work to make a call, to pick up the phone and call. It's work to get in your car, go visit somebody at their house that don't know Christ yet. It's work to spend your Saturday with lost people instead of going fishing or hiking after your own desires. It is even work sometimes to get up from the television and actually go to church so that you can be spiritually uplifted and being encouragement to other people. But this work pays off powerfully. I want to encourage you to remember that. Thirdly, they were praising, not asking. In actual fact, they were not praying. They were praising, not praying. We could even say that. As they were laying the foundation, they had singers in place, and they were praising God. Verse 11 says, with praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord. He is good, His love endures forever. That verse was last recorded when David brought in the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem to settle God on the holy mountain. They were not lamenting. That's not why they were singing. They were not asking God for anything. They were thanking Him. The word love refers to God's unfailing commitment to His people. They were acknowledging this. And the shout they gave was an indication that they acknowledged Him as their King. So they were praising, they weren't asking. So here we have three attitudes of proper God-honoring Christians. 3 attitudes. This is what sold out disciples of Jesus do. They're always looking for ways to give, to bless others. They are always ready to work, to make sacrifices. You don't have to drag them up like dead wood. They are always filled with thanksgiving because they focus on what God has given him and not on what He hasn't. The weak Christians of our world, they stick around so they can receive something from God. They're always asking something from God. They don't do much. They just sit around and wait to be fed, and everybody else must just feed them and serve them. And they are very good at asking for stuff. They're always looking at what they don't have instead of what they do have. My prayer today is that we make giving, working, and praising a priority in our spiritual lives. May God bless you this week. Love you all. Bye-bye.